Part 2, Chapter 7. The professor stood waiting among the throng of people at the Friendship Airport. He was taller than most of them, and the first thing Jeff saw was his glasses. Then the professor raised one hand. Jeff made his way over to his father. The professor's brown seersucker suit was rumpled. He didn't wear a tie. He looked at Jeff as if he hadn't seen him for so long he needed to be reminded of what Jeff looked like. But Jeff had made himself a place, inside himself, a kind of tower room, round without any windows. In that room he had locked his memory of the beach on the island, all the memories from the day hours and from the night hours. He had discovered how to step inside that room and slide the curved door closed and bolt it across. "You've only got a couple of days before school starts," the professor said. "Is there anything you want to do? Go to Ocean City or anything?" Jeff shook his head. "Let's get your suitcase. Did you have a good time?" "It was okay," Jeff said. They walked along with the throng, headed down the central aisle, then down the escalators to the baggage claim. "I bet we're going to have to get you a whole new set of clothes," the professor said. "You look like you were filled out some and gotten taller." Jeff said. "So," the professor said, "what's new?" "Nothing." The professor waited a long time before asking, "How's your mother?" Rage surged up against the outside of Jeff's tower room, a tall, black wave. "She's okay," he said, holding the door safe. Inside the room lay miles of solitary beaches, a spacious, peaceful place. As long as he could go there, Jeff would be safe. If the room was not there, he was afraid of what he might do, what he might say. If the room were not there, he would fall apart, disintegrate like music broken into individual melody lines, the lines turning into notes, the notes exploding into unconnected sounds, the sounds dissipating into space itself. If the room were not there in his mind, Jeff thought, there would be just a sharp stone wall, and he would stand in front of it and whack his head against it until his head burst open like a pumpkin. Protecting the room became a thing he did, the only thing, all of his days. He couldn't play his guitar, and neither could he look too carefully at the professor or the house they lived in together, because all those things distracted him from his watch over the tower door. Luckily, the professor didn't say much to him anyway. He was busy with his own life. At school, the classes of boys didn't bother Jeff either. The teachers left him alone as long as he kept quiet in class, although when they called on him and discovered that he couldn't answer questions, they looked at him in anger or suspicion or even pity. None of that made any difference to Jeff. He handed in his homework if he had done any, whether it was completed or not. He didn't even notice the other boys in his classes. The only thing Jeff could really do outside of his tower room he discovered by accident. One Saturday afternoon in October, he found that he'd wandered to the amusement park. He had money in his pocket, so he took a couple of rides, the roller coaster and the octopus. The sheer physical sensation of the speed and swooping were exciting in the same way that the island beach had been exciting. He rode the roller coaster time after time, alone in the car, soaring out on thin rails over the edge of the city, rising slowly up, 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 a steep grade until the train finally made its way over the top of the hill and fell down, dizzying and uncontrollable. The octopus was inside, with a huge warehouse-like building, which held also a carousel, a few rides small children could take, bumper cars, food concessions, and a bingo hall. The octopus turned in circles, the round-covered motor section at the center, 8 metal arms spreading out from that, and at the end of each arm 4 round cars, like the suction cups on a starfish. The cars circled on their own axles within the large circling machine. They swung so close to each other it seemed they must collide, but they never did. While the arms turned and the cars turned, music played and colored lights flashed overhead, pouring down over Jeff like fragments of sunlight. He sat back alone in his car, facing 3 empty seats, wearing sunglasses to make it impossible for anyone to see him, his arms spread along the back of the seat. If he relaxed as the car swung around, building up speed, if he concentrated on the rain of colors over him and the wind rushing by his ears, he could feel almost as if he were back on the beach. It was like trying to recapture a dream, and Jeff never could precisely feel as he had. But it was the nearest he could come. That first day he stayed at the park for hours. He went back every weekend, and gradually, when he learned it didn't make any difference, during the weekdays too. As the weather got colder, they closed down the outside rides, but Jeff only wanted to ride the octopus anyway. The inner rides stayed open all winter, so Jeff would be all right. The only times he could relax his vigilance at the door of his inner room was when his body swung with the movements of the octopus, and calliope music drowned out human voices, and the shattered prism of color poured over him. Jeff knew that somewhere outside of his tower room he was flunking courses, but the professor didn't know because Jeff had forged the professor's signature on his report card. He checked the mail before the professor saw it to throw out unopened envelopes that came from the university school. Jeff didn't ever know for sure what day of the week it was, so it wasn't exactly as if he was cutting classes. Some days the park was more crowded, some days not. Fall turned into cold winter, and on Christmas Day it was closed. Then it opened, and Jeff had someplace to go again. It was on an afternoon in the deep winter that Jeff sat in the round seat of the octopus alone, whirling under a waterfall of color. Inside himself, he was within the tower room. He could almost really taste the salt in the air. He could almost feel that what was pouring down over his skin was the sun. It was only almost, but almost promised so much and was so much better than nothing that he concentrated on losing himself into it. When the ride stopped, he rose carefully from his seat. If he moved slowly, he would not shatter his inner concentration, even when he went to give the man another ticket. So that when he heard someone call his name, it was as shocking as if somebody had slugged him in the face. He whipped around, frightened. The professor stood just beyond the gate. Brother Thomas, back from England, was with him. Jeff looked around for some place to run. They couldn't catch him. They were going to hurt him. He knew that. He knew how easy he was to hurt. There was no way out. So he just stood still inside the tower. He made them come to get him while he stayed safe. Each man took one of his arms and led him out of the enclosure. Brother Thomas stood in front of him, staring into his eyes. Jeff lowered his eyelids. Brother Thomas pulled them up with gentle fingers. He looked worried, puzzled. "Are you on anything?" he asked. Jeff shook his head. The professor's hand was on his shoulder. "I was so afraid," the professor said. "I'm sorry," Jeff said. They all went out to the professor's car. Jeff sat in the back, but they both turned around to stare at him. "You're supposed to be in a math exam now," the professor said. "You missed English and geography yesterday. Exams, Jeff, I don't understand. They called me. The principal did." He knew everything. "I'm sorry." The professor looked at Brother Thomas. "Take him home, Horace," Brother Thomas advised. "Take him home and feed him and make him talk to you. Your father," he said to Jeff, "wanted to leave you be since you wanted to be left alone. But you're going to have to tell him, whatever it is." Jeff didn't say anything at all. He had an hour anyway for the car to drive back to the city. He had an hour for the sun-bleached stretch of beach where waves broke and spread. When they sat across from one another at the little Formica kitchen table, and Jeff had finished his peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and the professor had brewed a mug of coffee, the professor said, "I'm sorry, Jeff. You're going to have to tell me about it. You've been different, and I don't know what it is. I didn't think it was drugs. I didn't think you'd be that stupid. But people say it's so hard to tell. Look at me, Jeff," he said, making Jeff beat his eyes. "I don't care about the schoolwork. I'm not angry. I'm frightened. Tell me what's bothering you, and we'll figure out the best way to handle it." "I'm okay," Jeff told him. "There isn't anything." "No, you're not okay. I'm not much of a father, but I can see that. You're not even really here, are you? You act as if you're 100 miles away. Where are you?" "I'm sorry," Jeff said. The professor sat back in his chair. He looked at the coffee in the mug. He moved his glasses back up his nose. His voice, when he spoke, was expressionless. "I thought myself, the way you've been acting, that it was probably Melody. I thought it had to have something to do with her. Judging from my own experience, I've been assuming that she told you somehow the way only Melody can that she didn't love you, and you thought she did." Jeff saw his own hands clench up into fists. His stomach, too, was clenched. He started to talk fast. "I'll tell you where I was the last day I went over to the beach, the last full day, an island, one of the sea islands, uninhabited. I had a boat. I bought it. I never explored that far before, and I spent the night there, and it was so beautiful. Nobody but me was there. I spent all day and all night and half the next day, too. I have a sand dollar I found. It's upstairs. I can show you." He looked down at his fists. "I can remember it. I can go there. Inside." It wasn't the worst time when Melody left me, the professor said. The worst time was the years before, because I didn't know I could hate anybody that much. I didn't know I could be that angry. I didn't know what to do except concentrate on my work. I didn't know anybody could hurt me, anybody else, that much. It was like she'd stuck a sword into me, one of those Japanese samurai swords. Do you know the kind I mean? Heavy and razor sharp and curved, and she'd stuck it in me, and then she was pushing it around. His hand rested on his stomach, remembering. I couldn't get free from the feelings. I didn't know how frightened I could be all the time, but whenever we had to go out together, she'd smile at me and talk to me and listen and look at me the way she did, and I wanted to hit her, he said, his voice low and ashamed. Jeff let his head down to rest his face on his fists. When I found out how many lies she was telling me, I finally realized that she had always lied to me. About my lectures, about boyfriends, and even after she knew I knew, she'd still lie about it. I hated her. Or the bills she ran up without asking, without telling. Then she'd say she'd taken care of them, but she just ignored them. I know I looked all right to other people, maybe more of a dry old stick than usual, maybe even more boring than usual, but inside I was knotted up all the time because I hated her so much, and I hated myself, and I was scared. Jeff looked up at his father. I didn't think she would do that to you, Jeff, the professor said. But she did, didn't she? Jeff nodded. He knew he was crying, but he didn't know what to do about it. Neither did the professor. He just sat and waited until Jeff got up to blow his nose. It was the lies, the professor said. They were what really scared me. Even now, if I think about her and the kinds of things she says, I don't know what she told you, but I never was sorry I'd married her or loved her because of you. You always made a difference, made a real difference from the very beginning. I always knew that inside me, but I didn't bother to learn how to show you. I'm sorry, Jeff. I should have taken the trouble. Jeff didn't know what to say, didn't even know what to think. He could see, as if it were familiar, his father during those early times, and see too what his father had seen, his son, unchanged by Melody's leaving, everything going on the same, although never the same because Melody had left, taking her own light with her. He could see what the professor's days had looked like to him, long, empty, to be endured until he could get used to things, day after day of waiting to get accustomed. And he could see the professor now, too. What the professor was seeing now. His father was frightened and worried about Jeff. Jeff knew that. Suddenly, he knew it as clearly as if the professor had said it aloud. He could receive the feeling, like some musical instrument, whether he wanted to or not. He could see what the professor saw as the professor saw it. Jeff, please, say something, the professor asked him. She told me she wanted a girl. She told me if I'd been a girl, she would have taken me with her. At that, the professor laughed. It was shaky, but it was a laugh. She's a liar, he said. Besides, I wouldn't have let her. Really? Really. I may be a dry old stick, but I'm not a fool, the professor told him. He got up from the table, spooned coffee from the can into the top of the coffee pot, and poured the boiling water through. Jeff washed his plate and poured a glass of milk. What was that about a boat? How could you get a boat? The professor asked in a normal voice. I had the money you were sending. It wasn't much of a boat. It only cost $15, plus $5 to tie it up at the dock. It was only a dinghy, not even painted. Jeff remembered how it felt once he'd learned how to handle it. He remembered going a little farther each day. It took me time to get used to it, to be not as frightened. I explored the island the same way. There was a lot to see, and the day I left I saw this great blue heron. Have you seen one? The professor hadn't. They're so beautiful and ugly, awkward. It flew over my head, right over, because I disturbed it. But it landed not very far at all, and it stayed there when I rode away. It didn't mind me. Where is the boat now? Jeff looked at his father. I sank it. You what? I didn't want anyone else to have it. I won't be going back there. The professor, calmer now, thought, You haven't played your guitar since you've been back, have you? It wasn't easy for the professor to think about how to say to Jeff what he wanted to say. Not like it was easy for Jeff to see. But the professor was doing it, trying as hard as he could, making himself. because Jeff mattered to him, and Jeff saw that now, and saw that he could count on that. He could feel himself relaxing. A memory that had been blocked away somewhere with other things Jeff didn't want to remember at all struck him like an unexpected wave. "You told me you sold a book." Now the professor looked surprised. "You did, in one of your notes, the last one. What happened to it?" The professor didn't know what to say. Jeff could see that. He didn't understand. Now that he had remembered why the professor had had nothing further to say about the book since Jeff's return. "Tell me," Jeff asked, "unless you don't want to. Unless whatever the deal was had fallen through?" "No, I do want to. It's just, I thought you weren't interested. I'm sorry. I just forgot." "You mean you wrote a book to be published?" The professor nodded. Why did he look embarrassed? Jeff wondered. "What kind of book is it?" "It's sort of a history book, biography. It's due to come out next fall. I'm finishing up revisions now." "Is the university press going to publish it?" Actually, the professor looked even more uncomfortable. "It's not one of the academic presses. It's a regular publisher. Does that make a difference?" "Evidently, it will be more available to the general public." "It must be good," Jeff said. "What's it about?" "It's a series of short biographies, just some people who have caught my attention." "Can I read it?" "I thought about that. I'd like you to wait until you're 15. I think then you'll be old enough. Will you promise me that?" "Sure, I promise. What's it called?" "Earth's Honored Guests." Not a very scholarly title. I don't know. I can't tell. The scholarship in the book is solid. I think they're afraid it'll be too scholarly. I don't know who would want to read it. But that's their business. I mean, they bought it, which means we have some extra money, and more when I get the revisions done, and the second half of the advance. It gives us some leeway, Brother Thomas says. "Leeway for what? Aren't you proud?" "I am proud, yes. Well, sometimes I am. It's pretty foreign country for me, Jeff. Leeway about you, about school, about what we're going to do about school. You can't possibly pass the year. They told me that. So we have to decide what to do." Jeff began to feel frightened again. "It doesn't make any difference," he said. "And you sank the boat?" the professor asked. "How do you sink a boat?" "It was old. I pounded the oar on the floorboards. It wasn't strong at all, really. Then I swam to the dock." "I'll try to make it all right, Jeff," the professor said, "whatever we decide to do." Well, January turned to February, and a week of warm weather was followed by sharp, sporadic storms of snow and sleet. The professor didn't do anything about Jeff. Jeff stayed home and played on his guitar. Brother Thomas came around frequently, but if he had anything to say about Jeff, he kept it for the professor. He brought Jeff a thick volume of songs collected in England by a man named Childs. Jeff put the volume aside for later and went back to relearning the songs he had once been able to play well. In mid-February, the professor took Jeff for an appointment with the principal of the university school. Jeff sat silent while the two men talked. He had worn the gray flannels and blazer, and stared unseeing eyes at the toes of his polished shoes. The professor wanted to withdraw Jeff from school, and the principal agreed that might be all for the best. He talked about academic pressures on a student of less than average ability, and he didn't look at Jeff. He suggested testing to get a precise fix on just what the limits were. He suggested therapy because socialization was well below norm. The professor didn't disagree. When they finally walked out of the office, down the hall, and out onto the icy brick front steps, Jeff said, "I'm sorry." "We'll see," the professor said. He didn't seem to be listening to Jeff. "We'll give it some time, and then we'll see. Don't you worry, Jeff." Jeff left his father alone to think it out. His father needed time to think things out. They also went to visit Dr. Baker, who did a complete physical, then listened as the professor recounted what Jeff had done. Jeff listened too, as if they were talking about somebody else. "It sounds as if some counseling is in order," Dr. Baker said. He smiled at Jeff as he spoke. Jeff didn't say anything. "I'd like to give it some time," the professor said. "I'm not ruling the possibility out, but I don't believe anyone can understand as well as I can what effect his mother could have on him." The doctor laced his fingers together and said to the professor, "It's not only his mother. He hasn't been primarily in her care, has he?" The professor didn't answer that right away. "I understand," he said at last. "I see what you must think, and you're correct. I understand that. I guess I'd like a little time myself. Circumstances permit a little more freedom this year." He looked at Jeff. "I would like to keep him out of school and have him repeat 8th grade next year, somewhere else." "Jeff?" Dr. Baker asked. Jeff looked up at him. He had been thinking about the beach again and how the pelicans swooped low over the water, scooping up their prey with buckety beaks. What do you think? Doesn't make any difference to me. Dr. Baker studied him for a long time. Jeff kept his face expressionless and looked right back. I don't know, Dr. Green. I can testify to his being run down, and it certainly doesn't sound as if he should go back to school, especially not if the year is already shot. I have to say that I think counseling is strongly indicated, but not urgent, not at this point. But I'd have to have your word to get in touch with me if, I don't know, if there were the smallest sign of trouble, or even lack of improvement. You have my word. Thank you, the professor said. I hope I've learned. I think I'm learning. We have a family friend who's much quicker than I am, Brother Thomas, he said to Jeff's raised face. You have my word, he said to Dr. Baker. The professor didn't speak to Jeff again until they arrived back home, and Jeff was about to go up to his room to play the guitar. I can't change. Not really, the professor said. That's okay, Jeff told him. He already knew that. And he liked that in his father. But even if we can't change me, I've been thinking, we might change this. The professor waved his hand around, indicating the hallway. Jeff didn't understand. Would you mind moving? The professor asked him. No. So they became acquainted with a real estate agent who carried a large zip case with her wherever she went, wrote everything down with quick, nervous hand, and talked constantly, calling the professor Dr. Green. She drove them around to show them houses in the city and the suburbs. She advised them not to fix their house up. I thought about that, Dr. Green, and while it would cost you thousands just to have it painted inside and out, you wouldn't ever realize what you spent in the sales price. I think we should sell it as a bargain. She drove them around in her big white car and walked them through other people's houses. She even showed them a mansion out in the western suburbs, built out of white stucco with a tall fence enclosing a garden and green hills rolling behind it. We can't afford it, he said to his father. Hardly. A pity, except if you think about trying to keep the lawns mowed, the professor said. Yeah, Jeff agreed. What he really liked about the property was the garden and the hillsides around. It was at that point in April that they started looking farther afield. They drove out to the north, but that was being developed too rapidly. To the south, but Annapolis was too much like a city. And over the long bay bridge to the eastern shore. As soon as he saw the flat landscape, the sky stretched out flat like a blanket overhead, the water appearing at unexpected places, Jeff breathed easier. The professor had no Friday classes, so they spent weekends driving around, going farther south each time to find something they could afford that still suited them. They spent nights in motels where Jeff played his guitar and the professor made notes on pages of books or wrote lecture notes. They spent days with real estate agents or just driving around towns. They saw houses they liked on land they didn't, land they liked with a house neither of them wanted to live in. It seemed that if they liked a town, they could find nothing for sale in it, and if there were a lot of houses available, they didn't like the town. Until deep in the western corner, an agent drove them down a dirt road to a little cabin that sat on high land, high for that part of the country. A one-room, red-shingled cabin that faced across a broad creek to marshes, that sat right on a point where the creek emptied into the Chesapeake Bay. The cabin was just one room, with a bathroom tacked on to the back. The whole front wall was plate glass doors that looked out over to where the creek flowed by, hurrying into the bay, and where the level tops of marsh grasses were all you could see except for a line of low trees at the distance. Mice and roaches scurried away as they entered the room. Spiders had made complex webs in places where bare roof beams came together at the peak. A bunk bed, a stove, and refrigerator, a chipped sink, a table, 3 chairs, 2 roll-away beds, a wood-burning stove made out of thin tin and rusting through in many places, stacks of newspaper. The room was crowded. The walls were bare plywood, the floor plywood laid down in sheets. The air was damp and musty. Jeff stood by the window looking out, not listening. He went outside, leaving the 2 men inside, looking around and talking. He made his way down to the creek, down to a 5-foot muddy bank, to a band of sand too narrow to lie down on. He had to force his way through the honeysuckle vines and the branches of low, wild cherry trees, so his approach was clumsy, noisy. As he slid to his feet, a great blue heron croaked loudly just off to his left, and at the same time rose out and flew away, complaining, to land on the far side of the creek. From there the bird stared at Jeff. Jeff stared back, not moving, except for the smile on his mouth. The bird decided Jeff was harmless and paced slowly upstream, its attention on the shallow water where prey might be found. The long, stilty legs, the long, curved neck, the awkward, perfect body moved inland, away from Jeff. He watched it. He watched it not find anything to eat, watched it come to a rest and blend into the stillness of a dead tree that had fallen out into the creek. The two men were still inside when Jeff rejoined them. The professor looked at his face and said, "You like it." Jeff nodded. "I saw a blue heron." "They're common around here," the agent said. "You all bird watchers?" But the professor remembered and understood what Jeff meant. "You take that as a sign from the gods?" Jeff nodded. "Well, I like it myself. Let's take a walk around and see." "If you'll excuse us," he said to the agent. The agent dusted off a wooden chair and sat down, ready to be patient. Behind the cabin grew loblollies, wild cherries, holly, swamp oaks. The small area of lawn that circled the cabin was sparse and untended. Jeff and the professor walked to the bank and looked down the creek to the bay. "There'll be mosquitoes," the professor said. "There are only these 3 high acres in the property. It'll never be worth anything for development." "Good," Jeff said. "It's awfully isolated. You'll be alone a lot." "That's all right." Jeff waited for his father to finish thinking out the major objections. That was the way the professor did things. "But I agree with you. It's like an island, isn't it?" Jeff hadn't thought of that. He'd thought only of the quiet water noises, the sense of space and peace. "I guess it is. I really like it, Professor." "Not at all what I imagine Charleston looks like." "Not a bit," Jeff agreed, "except it's like that island, just like you said." "You didn't see alligators?" The professor sounded alarmed. "No, Professor, I didn't. Alligators need a warmer climate, just like the heron." "Then we'd better make a bid on it, don't you think? It doesn't do to disregard a sign from the gods. Back to the office. We'll have to add on some rooms, redo the bathroom entirely, finish off that room for year-round living, maybe gravel the driveway so it won't wash away in bad weather. I guess the septic system's all right. He says it's only 2 years old. And a dock. We'll need a dock." "What for?" "For your boat. Let's go get the business over." "I thought so," the agent said with satisfaction. "I thought you were the right people for this, soon as I saw you." "You appear to have been correct," the professor said. "What's the nearest town, and how far are we from it?" "Crisfield," the agent said. "You're about 8 miles out as the crow flies. Maybe 10 or a little more by road." "But what about you, Professor?" Jeff had a picture of the map of Maryland in his mind. He remembered where Crisfield was and where Baltimore was in relation to that. "How will you get to work?" "I can arrange my schedule so that it's only a couple of nights a week I'd need to be away. I can stay at the faculty club or with Brother Thomas. As long as you can take the solitude, it shouldn't be hard to arrange." "I can take it," Jeff said. "You know that." He thought his father might be teasing him. The professor bought the property, as he called it, and sold their little house in Baltimore. Before they moved, they had a lot of work done on the cabin. They added hallways and 2 bedrooms going off opposite sides of the kitchen. They ripped out the old bathroom and had an entirely new one put in. They had the cabin insulated, its walls finished. New double-paned glass doors replaced the old ones in the kitchen. They both wanted to leave the ceiling unfinished, so they did. They had the long driveway graded and covered with oyster shells. They put a short dock out into the creek and steps down the steep bank leading to it. They drove down frequently to check on the progress and watched the swarming workmen, carpenters, glaziers, roofers, painters, and listened to the sounds of saws and the pile driver. Brother Thomas seemed to find unflagging humor in everything about the new house. "How big is this piece of wilderness?" he asked. "And how's Jeff going to get to school? By dog sled? And you putting any crops in, Farmer Green?" The professor answered him mildly. "When it's done, you'll come down to visit, on the property." Jeff didn't call it that. To himself, he called it a safe place. And when they were finally settled in at the end of July, living in the 3-room house where the windows gave out over the water and woods and sky, he knew he had been right. When they had bought a little skiff, an 11-foot wooden boat painted white, with a 7.5-horsepower outboard motor, and took his father exploring up the creek, winding among the branches of fallen trees, staring up the banks of little cabins or waterfront homes, or meandering across the marshes on one of the canals that ran into the creek, the water so shallow they had to raise the motor and pull the boat, he knew he had been righter than he thought. The professor didn't seem to mind the inconveniences, the distance from the grocery store and libraries, the mosquitoes that rose up like a mist on windless evenings, the necessity of keeping Coleman lanterns available for power failures when thunderstorms moved up the bay. Sometimes the professor would even suggest himself that Jeff take him out in the boat. I need to get away from myself for a while. Want to go up the bay shore a ways? They didn't talk much on such trips, but looked about them. The professor wore a floppy white spinnaker hat to protect his face from the sun and looked out over the water where a fish would often reward his vigil by leaping up out of the water. Jeff wore only shorts or trunks and studied the shoreline. He was learning the names of birds and trees, learning also how to scan the water's edge for where a great blue might be standing in camouflage, looking like a branch of one of the fallen trees or blending into the grass. The blues roosted, he had learned, on the high branches of trees. If he wandered outside at night and let the door slam behind him, he could hear them taking off, squawking from their roosts. They never traveled together. They never shared fishing territory. He liked to think that they squawked their displeasure with one another, and him, and the state of the world. Great cranky birds, the Indians had named them. He told the professor this as they sat in the boat at the mouth of the creek, rocking gently as the tide carried them out onto the bay. I don't know why they're so jumpy, Jeff said. There isn't anything that preys on them, is there? What spooks them? Women with big hats, the professor said. Jeff looked at the back of his father's head. His neck was getting tan, Jeff noticed. Jeff always ran the boat because the professor couldn't seem to learn how to handle it. He tried to figure out what his father meant. A fish jumped off to starboard. An egret, snowy white, fished along the muddy shallows, its path crossing with two of its fellows. Egrets shared their fishing territory with one another. Come on, Professor, Jeff said. I was serious. Oh, so was I. The professor turned around to look earnestly at Jeff. When women wore those picture hats with hat pins, one of the prized adornments was heron feathers. Jeff thought that and thought about his father's response to his question. He started to laugh, a small bubbling humor from in his stomach. But that's funny what you said. I have my moments, the professor answered, and turned back to the water. But he was pleased. Jeff knew that. Evenings the professor studied or wrote or read a mystery. Jeff played his guitar. They had decided against a television, had bought a stereo instead, and a radio so they could hear the news and weather. Sometimes the professor joined Jeff in the kitchen, which they had turned into what magazines called a family kitchen, with sofa and chairs near the Franklin stove the professor had insisted on having. Sometimes he worked in his room. Are you writing another book? Jeff asked his father one night, watching him wander to the window to look out over the water, which ran red under the last light of the setting sun. The professor turned, but didn't focus his eyes on Jeff. I think maybe, he said. Jeff began playing on his guitar softly. The professor didn't mind. He'd given Jeff only a fraction of his attention, Jeff knew, because he was thinking of something else. Jeff worked out a background for one of the songs he's heard in Charleston. It needed, he thought, a kind of jingle to it, almost like a tambourine, as if the guitar were one of those cigar box banjos. He thought the Martin could make that kind of sound if he could figure out how to get it out of his fingers. Oh, Lord, you know, I have no friend like you, he sang. He almost had it, but not quite, and I can't feel at home in this world any more. The professor drifted back to his room. The world is not my home, I'm only passing through, Jeff sang. He was getting closer to the sound he wanted. They registered Jeff in school and got him a 10-speed bicycle for days when he didn't want to take the bus. The guidance counselor didn't even ask him why he was repeating the 8th grade. The professor didn't ask whether Jeff was strong enough to bike the miles to school, but he did suggest that Jeff might want to build up his muscles. So Jeff packed sandwiches and took long rides on empty roads that went along for miles between intersections. He learned every turn of the flat road into Crisfield, became familiar with the farm set back behind fields, their barns bright tin or bright red, with the little houses set up close to the road, with the clusters of trailer homes, the rectangular fields framed by loblollies. He learned the names on mailboxes along the road to school, most of them standing opposite trim driveways as erect as soldiers. Only one mailbox was neglected, tilted over, its door always hanging open, its paint chipped, its name faded away to Lerma. He became familiar with the stores in the shopping center a mile before the school, the large antiseptic supermarket that carried medicines as well as school supplies and even some clothing, and with the less modern stores down at the town center, the hardware, the restaurant, the small grocery whose windows were streaked with grime. On good days, Jeff took the boat out. He learned to dangle chicken necks at the end of a piece of string to catch crabs. He could, he knew, set pots out on a line, then run the boat along the line, pulling up the pots to see what he would caught. That would have been more efficient, but he preferred the quiet of the boat anchored in the middle of the creek. He preferred the lazier pace. He'd bait 5 or 6 strings and dangle them over the side of the boat. He left them undisturbed until he saw, by movement of a string on the gunwales, that a crab was feeding on the bait. Then he would take the string in his fingers and pull it gently in, feeling the crab at the other end, knowing it had one claw firmly fixed on the chicken neck, while the other ripped off pieces of flesh to eat greedily. Gently, smoothly, so the crab wouldn't sense anything unnatural, Jeff pulled the string in until he could see the crab, now a few inches beneath the water's surface. He held the bait steady by stepping on the string and picking up his net. He scooped the crab in the net, dumped it into the bushel basket, and tossed out the string again, feeding out line until the bait came to rest on the creek bottom. They often had steamed crabs for dinner, eating them with cornbread made from a mix, or biscuits, or glasses of beer or wine or iced tea. Jeff tried to teach the professor how to catch crabs, but his father's hands were clumsy. Somehow, his crabs always swam off from the bait before the professor could net them. Jeff, watching, admired the crab's sideways retreat. The crab slipped away, angling into the darker, deeper water. "I don't know how you do it," the professor said to Jeff. "I don't know how you can't," Jeff answered. "High natural ineptitude," the professor said. "I'd rather read anyway." He sat and did just that most of the time, moving his legs out of Jeff's way when Jeff moved around the boat to check the lines. Brother Thomas, who came to stay for a week in late August, took a more voluble interest in crabbing and Crisfield, especially the workboats that moored at the town dock, especially in the history, especially in everything. "Look at all the churches," he said, walking along the residential streets that ran back behind the town. "Look at those old Victorian houses, the gingerbreading. I think someone would fix them up. Who do you suppose built them?" Brother Thomas, in the bright Hawaiian shirts he wore on vacation, wandered happily through the stores, talking with anyone nearby. He met the local priest. He talked with the old men who sat in the shade of shacks by the dock, among miniature mountains of oyster shells. "This is a wonderful life. I don't know how you found this place," Brother Thomas said. "It must be your background as a geographer, Horace." Jeff asked. They were all sitting outside on low chairs. The men drank chilled white wine, and Jeff watched the egrets feeding on the opposite side of the creek. A wind blew the mosquitoes away, so they sat in comfort. "I started out specializing in geography," the professor explained to him. "Why?" Jeff asked. "I was interested. Seemed like a good way to get grants to travel." "Did you know your father won a Rhodes Scholarship?" Jeff didn't know that. "But that was in 1945, so he couldn't take it. Honestly, Horace, it's almost pathological, your secretiveness." "It never came up," the professor said. "Besides," Jeff said, "it's not the kind of question you think to ask. By the way, what academic prizes did you win? It's not like, what do you want for dinner, or can I take any library books back for you, is it?" They were all stretched out in their chairs, and the quiet stretched out around them. "My only question now is, how often can I come back?" Brother Thomas asked. "As often as you like. The sofa bed is there for you," the professor said. Jeff heard in their voices their contentment. They were two of a kind, he saw. Two quiet men, each able to respect what was central to the other's life, both intellectuals. Brother Thomas had a deep, stabilizing faith. Although he didn't talk about it, it was always with him. The professor had his study of history, whether reading it, writing about it, or thinking it over. It was always there in him, always important. Jeff saw why they were friends. "You going to get a dog to keep Jeff company?" Brother Thomas asked. "And a red wagon, too?" the professor asked. "Why would I need a red wagon?" Jeff asked. "That's what every boy should have, a dog and a little red wagon," the professor told him. "No, thanks. Not that I'm ungrateful, but a dog would chase away the birds and the raccoons." "But," Brother Thomas said, "it could pull you to school in your little red wagon." Jeff chuckled.